Hey, I'm Jill Johns.
I'm Anita Brown.
And you are watching the Pause Button 2.0.
Upgrading your self-care. Sorry, I'm really not on. I'm not on right now.
All right, episode number 4. For those that have been listening to our previous podcasts, you've heard us talking a lot about boundaries. And so we've decided to devote this episode to some of our boundary stories and how we got to the realization that boundaries were necessary. Professionally and personally.
That's right. Because everything we've talked about so far requires boundaries being set in order to happen. So let's talk more about boundaries. Let's dive into it.
Let's dive in. Let's go. So tell me about your kind of aha awakening with the need for boundaries.
Well, my aha moment really was not that long ago.
Okay.
I was working with a client over several visits, and the client kept getting more and more inappropriate, I guess. And I didn't really realize it at the time.
So what kind of client was it?
So I'm a massage therapist. Okay. I'm a massage therapist. And this client, and I was really seeing myself as a medical professional, or a healthcare professional. So when people come to me, I take their health seriously. And this client was talking about some issues he was having with getting erections when he was laying down. And he was wondering what might be causing that to happen.
Okay.
So,
and that's a valid medical issue.
I mean, theoretically, it's a medical issue, but not for a massage therapist, right?
Warning bell.
And the thing is, like, there wasn't a warning bell. That's the thing, is like, to me, it was like his medical issue, like, was my issue because I don't have any boundaries, right? Okay. So, and what was the problem? I mean, there's obviously when people are overly suggestive, like, to asking me to give them a hand job or something, like, or wanting, like, if it's that, it's a red flag, right? But this coming at this talking about his penis, basically, under the guise that there's this health issue that he's got, and I'm taking this seriously, and he was wanting to know how, like, what might be causing this from muscle or nerve kind of problem. Okay. And so I wanted to honor that and take it seriously and help that issue. I mean, it got to a point where it's like I maybe identified a nerve that could be the problem and some muscles that the nerve travels through. But beyond that, like, it was out of my hands. Like, so I kind of felt like I'd given the most I could give in that instance, right? Okay.
And this was over the course of multiple visits?
Yeah, over the course of multiple visits, yeah. And then one particular visit where it's like, okay, well, let's look this up here, on the computer, here's the nerve, here's where it goes, and whatever. But then kind of feeling like my hands are washed of this, like I'm done with this issue. And that's not even like that's not the issue he was coming to me for. It was like, low back pain or whatever. But further visits, he's still talking about his erection. He told me that he had an erection once that he was like, oh, Anita would be proud of this. And I was like thinking, why the fuck would I be proud of your erection? And it's like the fact that he was thinking about me while he had an erection somewhere else, like, then it was a red flag. Yeah. So then it was like, this is not okay, but I didn't know how to shut it down.
Well, but now you're multiple visits in, it's a regular client,
right. And so it's like regular
medical.
Right. So it's regular money. But the real problem with that more so is that, like, I didn't know how to just say,
fuck you.
Yeah,
this is
fuck
gross.
You, dumb. Yeah, like, go away now. Right. Like, you're out.
Yeah. Sure.
Because I'm wanting to always be nice, and I'm wanting to always be accepting.
Well, and assuming that people are good, right? Like, not coming at it like assuming that every man that walks into your appointments is going to be a perv.
Right. And so, so there was those issues surrounding, like, why I couldn't establish a boundary of, like, I'm done talking about your penis.
Right.
But then finally, it got to an appointment where where I was massaging, he was saying, like, oh, that feels like I'm in an erection, like, keep doing that, like, and I'm like, well, I'm not gonna keep doing, like, if you feel like you're getting an erection right now, like, that's
we're gonna back off.
We're gonna back off. We're gonna
not push that spot.
And he was like, no, I want you to try to give me one. And I was like, dude, you trying to get an erection is something you need to do at home with your wife.
Right.
This is not the reason to come to massage therapy.
Right.
So I did finally like say that and ended the session.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we were already at the end of the session anyway, so it was basically asking me for a happy ending, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So end of the session, and then it was like, you know, bye and whatever. But I just had this like gut, it was this like feeling in the pit of my stomach of like, first of all, I was blaming myself for letting it go on so long.
Right.
And
guilt, shame.
Yes. And then thinking, how can I put an end to this? Like, how can I just not see this person anymore? So, I recruited the help of some colleagues and had come up with some professional verbiage to just end this relationship. And so that happened. And so that was good. But it was like the awareness kind of like the light turned on with the awareness of,
man, if I don't set those,
yeah, it's like this keeps happening, or this happens because boundaries. Like earlier on, if I would have was aware of like, I don't need to talk about something.
Like we don't say the word erection.
Yeah, like I don't need to talk about your erection. Like it has nothing to do with massage therapy. That's not ever why somebody should be coming to massage.
Right.
And so, so that was. I was realizing like earlier on, if I had a boundary where like I don't talk about erections, and that would be the red flag there.
Okay.
You know, it would be like, oh, you're talking about erection, you need to go see your whoever talks about erections.
Yeah,
right?
your urologist or something.
Yeah. And so I decided to kind of like seek professional help, like a professional helping a professional get better boundaried.
Okay.
And I saw a social worker, and I told her like the reason I was there was for professional boundaries.
Okay.
But of course she wanted to know more about who I am and my backstory and all this. And the more I dove into my personal life and telling her the story of who I am and the story of who I was and all that, the baggage and everything, the more I realized boundaries were also not established in my young life. They weren't established in my teen life, my adolescence, my young life, my young adulthood. Or in my marriage in some ways. And that was...
So you were wanting help in that one area, but now
it's like only touch this part
to say you've got boundary issues everywhere.
And it was way too scary for me at the time to talk about the boundaries that I didn't have in my personal life. And so I let that relationship fizzle. Like, you know, it's like, oh, I, you know, had to cancel an appointment and then just never rescheduled it until a few years later when finally... I got to that point in my marriage where I was like, things need to change. And that's when boundaries came back up and actually got established.
Okay.
So,
and then was that able to transpose forward to all those other bubbles that needed to be?
Yes, it is kind of. Well, I mean, it's still kind of scary, the whole saying no thing that we've talked about. But it really made me realize boundaries in your personal life, it starts bubbling over. It always starts with you having boundaries with yourself, and then the boundaries with those closest to you, and then the next layer out. So, yeah.
Well, do you think? So, as I was listening to your story, I was thinking, you know, how do we know when to set? Do we have to have that negative experience? Do we have to have somebody push the limit of the boundary and us get on that other side before we go, oh, wait, there should have been a boundary there and now we've gone too far. So now that I've crossed the boundary with this person, I'll know how in future instances not to cross the boundary with these others because I'll have the boundary established. Or how do we go about establishing boundaries without having to have some of the negative experiences that create the need for boundaries?
Well, you know, that's a good question. I can only start from where I am. And so I often have those negative experiences and realize if I'm in a situation, I'm suddenly like, I'm really pissed at this person or this situation or whatever. That is my cue, my emotional cue to listen to the information my emotions are trying to give me. And to me, anger is a boundary violation.
And boundaries being we had an expectation and that expectation, some line got crossed.
Yeah, do you think? I mean, like whether it's a time issue, like if somebody's constantly late, if I'm constantly late to arriving to hang out with you, and you might get angry at me, and that anger is going to tell you, it's going to just inform you of what your expectation is of me, right? Like you might be angry that I'm never calling and letting you know, or that I'm calling and still late, or like at some point you're like, be on time.
Get here.
If you're wanting me to be on time.
Right.
So to me, that anger is a time for us to get information about like what's being violated right now. It's just
with that clarity about what our expectations were that weren't being met, that's causing us to react with anger toward the situation.
Right.
And then asking ourselves if we've, because a lot of it too is implicit expectations. We've never shared those expectations with the other person, so they don't know that that's the yardstick that they're being measured against.
And we might have not even realized that we had those expectations until we feel the anger, and then we're like, no.
I really need for people to be on time, or I really need for people to keep their penis in their pants.
Right, or like not talk to me about their erections while they're on the massage table. But how do we learn it? I'm also wondering, I mean, it's either we're learning it by having an issue, or it's being fed to us, as youngsters growing up, and then having our parents kind of tell us about boundaries, or having parents
model the behavior.
And so that we adopt their boundaries. But even still, at some point, I think we have to determine, is that a boundary for us, or is that their boundary
that we're just using?
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, I think when I think back to the experiences I have that have created the need for boundary, it hasn't been a positive experience to get there. It's been because something uncomfortable or gross or unfortunate or damning or whatever has happened. And all of a sudden it's like, oh man, coulda, shoulda, woulda. And then we beat ourselves up over how bad we suck or what we should be doing differently or how we can't. For me, it's like, I should have done this different. I should have done that different. And it's like, or I take that, beating myself up piece and just say, oh, here's a topic that I might need some boundaries around because I don't like how I feel. I don't like what I'm experiencing. So let me create a boundary there now and not get across that threshold again.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that we're so willing to just like shame ourselves for a boundary violation instead of, I guess, just using that information.
Yeah.
To establish
biofeedback.
Yeah. But it's easier, I guess, to confront ourselves sometimes than to confront other people.
Yeah, I had a string for months, years, maybe, I don't know, where anytime anybody, so being spouse, friend, child, would bring me an issue after 9:00 at night, I usually ended up becoming an ugly version of myself, short, snippy, angry, condescending, some of the stuff that is my shadow side. And so I was eventually realizing the pattern that it was like, anytime anybody brings me something after 9:00, I'm not my best self. I end up saying things I don't want to say. So I started establishing an air quote rule in the family that if you've got to bring me a bad grade, or if you've got this issue going on at school, or if spouse, you want to talk to me about something, you have to bring it to me before 9:00 because otherwise I'm just at risk of how I'm going to behave. And I would hold that line. And then every so often I would let the rule slip, and I'd bring up a topic to my husband at 9:30 or my kid would come to my room with something at 10. And then inevitably every time it would turn ugly and I would be like, what the fuck was I doing? I know better. It was after 9:00. Don't do this. And so I've found that I've had to and that's just a simple example from a time boundary perspective, but I've really had to analyze my behavior, realize what I think the solution is, try out the solution, and then hold firm on that solution and then train the other people around me, train my kids, train my husband, train myself to say, don't come to me then. But it's been an interesting journey to kind of establish that boundary with myself and with others. And I think having that win and that success has created boundaries in other places too. Yeah. Boundaries.
With, so you said time boundaries, there's so many different kinds of boundaries. And so a few years ago, I was teaching massage therapy. And when I was teaching, part of it is going over ethics. And since when I had my own experience with having bad boundaries as a professional, I was able to tell them really from experience, this is why you need good time boundaries. This is why you need good personal boundaries. This is why you need good money boundaries in your practice. And so it also brought up the awareness that there are so many different kinds of boundaries that we need to establish. Time is one of them.
I wonder, I'd be curious to know how those students did with being told about boundaries versus did they then have to butt up against their boundary line in order to really be able to hold firm with what their boundaries were.
Sure, because I mean, like just having parents trying to tell us about the world versus us, we're like, no, I got this. I got it.
It might have happened to you, but it won't happen to me, and then it happens to you.
Yeah, right. So, but it's helpful for me to just talk about it with them, But it was really nice. We could talk about it in the classroom, but then when they got to clinical, where we had, people coming in, they were doing student massages, I was able to bring back like,
remember
you telling that story about your own personal life while the person's on the client, that is a boundary violation. And, your client is going to be 10 minutes late. How do you feel about that? What kind of policy are you going to establish in your practice? So they got to think about those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it goes back to the consent conversation too. It's like understanding what your boundary line is, where that line gets crossed, what you will accept, what you won't accept, and that drawing firm to that. Interesting.
So how do you think you teach your kids boundaries?
The catchphrase that we've used over the years has been, and maybe this isn't as much boundaries as it is behaviors, but I think a lot of behaviors are playing with boundaries and borderlines. And so my conversations with them have always been, how would whatever you just did, how would it feel if you read about it on the front page of the newspaper? How would it feel if grandpa and grandma found out about it? And, when you get to the pearly gates, how was that going to work kind of thing? And so using that as their go, no-go gauge for understanding like what feels in alignment with who they are versus what might be something that they would be uncomfortable with. And so I think using that same kind of strategy with boundaries about their behavior and what they'll accept from other people as well is just at least a tool for helping them establish boundaries with people. But I don't know. I think, it goes back to the, you can tell your stories, model the behaviors. It becomes age sensitive conversations as well. I have a tendency to push on a little bit like, Mom, we don't want to hear that side from me. But I want to be able to plant those seeds so that they can start thinking about it so that when they're in the situation, they've got framework versus having to do the postmortem and come talking about it afterwards.
Yeah, so in my family, boundaries wasn't a topic, growing up. It was more of a modeled, either, no boundaries being modeled or some boundaries being modeled. So kids are going to learn it no matter if you're talking about it or not.
Right.
So modeling the boundaries is really an important teaching tool, and you have to be aware of what your needs are, aware of red flags and aware of your emotions. And that's really, since I was like an emotional denier, like I just denied all emotions that weren't just like happiness or something, that I wasn't even aware of, this makes me uncomfortable or this makes me angry or whatever. It was always like, no, you just need to accept.
Well, and as you're talking, it's making me realize that I am a rationalizer. And so when situations start to happen, I can if I was the massage therapist and this guy is starting to talk to me about his erection, I would have gone through the rationalizing route of like, well, it's a medical thing, or it's a this, or it's a that. But maybe my intuition or my gut would be going, Jill, I'm not quite sure. Like my spidey sense might be going off, and I'm not sure how you can teach people to tune into their spidey sense. I guess with our meditation and mindfulness practices and just the self-awareness and your emotions, you start to like clue into that more and more. But when I look back on all of the times where my boundaries were crossed or where I didn't have boundaries and it got uncomfortable, it's because I was rationalizing the situation. I was trying to like utilize my brain and my rational thoughts to like quiet and tamp down like some of the feeling things that I was feeling. And I have to ask myself, like, if I would have just gone with what wasn't feeling right in my gut or just wasn't sitting right in my body, like, would I have crossed that boundary? Would I have gone too far? And so for my kids, I think that's a great idea, just to remind them to just trust your gut as well.
Teaching them to pay attention to their feelings, being able to identify what their feelings are and then to honor them.
I feel uncomfortable right now, or this doesn't feel right. I don't have to, it doesn't matter why. It's like saying no, right? I don't have to tell you why I'm saying no. I don't have to tell you why this doesn't feel good. I can just acknowledge that this just doesn't feel good, period.
Right.
And the relationship shift, the dynamic, whatever.
Yeah. No, it's interesting you're saying about the using your brain and your intellect versus your gut and your feelings, because when I was in my good therapy, for a year, really digging this stuff up, one of the things that she would always say to me is that, like, I'm intellectualizing. Like, I would just intellectualize a situation or experience and not bring any feeling into it at all. And I really had to learn to identify, like, to feel the feeling and identify what that feeling was, and use that information to actually create a boundary or establish like what I need to do about it.
Yeah, I agree. I think about the time for me where it was like, oh fuck, like this boundary has been crossed. It was too far, too much. I was working in a professional environment, again, back to single mom, 2 little kids, good job, part of an executive development program. So I was assigned an executive coach, and we had got to pick from these bios of these executive coaches, like which one fits with you. And I picked the one that had like I wanted one that met certain criteria, and this dude met all those criteria. And so then I spent months and months and months building a fairly vulnerable relationship with this person, talking about my personal life, my professional life, my aspirations, and, getting coached in that process. And then in those conversations came out that we both like to cook, right? Just kind of like you and I like to cook. And then it was like, oh, I'm a foodie. You're a foodie. Sweet. We're foodies. And so then the conversation went to, we should grab dinner sometime. But it was like, strictly platonic relationship or colleague. Yeah, right. And then all of a sudden it was like, well, we really like the food at restaurants, but wouldn't it be better if we cooked? And I was like, actually, I like to cook better than I like to eat, but I don't have anybody to cook with usually because it's just me and the kids. So it's chicken nuggets and whatever. So yes, grown-up food. And all of a sudden I found myself in this situation, in this home, at a kitchen, making food with a person that I thought was trustworthy. And all of a sudden, like, my spidey senses going off, like, oh shit, Jill, like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, how did you get in this situation? How did you not see the red flags? Like, this is not okay. And then the situation got really uncomfortable, and it was like something where I had to leave abruptly and all that kind of stuff. And then, oh man, the guilt and the shame. And like, even in telling the story now, it's like, there should have been, could have been maybe red flags going off, but there weren't, because I was in that naive, rational, trusting type situation with someone. And then what ended up happening from that situation was that my pendulum swung the other way, where now I trust no one.
Yeah.
If it's a man, I don't want to be near him or around him, especially if it's an older man that's acting like he wants to be a mentor, all these things. So it made me distrusting of myself. And so because I was distrusting of my ability to discern a scary situation from a safe situation, I ended up lumping everybody over here into the, you must be a villain, you must want to sexually assault me, you aren't to be trusted. And that's not healthy either, because then now, like, I was compartmentalizing this whole, so now my boundary was so small, right? So like over here, when the situation happened, I had no boundaries. But then to like manage that situation, I ended up creating such tight boundaries that I really wasn't able to thrive in my professional environment anymore. So I think it's, figuring out, and then, now with time, I've kind of loosened and figured out kind of a comfortable zone. But I think that establishing those boundaries and knowing how to hold them and maintain them and kind of listen to your gut is just paramount.
I think so. Establishing those boundaries. What I discovered in therapy in boundary setting was it was so hard for me because I really felt like I wasn't worth setting the boundaries for. Like, my own sense of self-worth was so lacking that I felt like I had no right to set a boundary.
Oh, wow.
So that took a lot of emotional work to get to a point where it's like, no, I am worth something.
Yes.
I'm worth
Absolutely.
it. And being able to set those boundaries. But then every situation you get into is a new
opportunity.
To set a boundary and to rediscover that you are worth to set this boundary. So a lot of it was, personal relationships, obviously, but time boundaries for me is like a huge thing. So with work, particularly being a self-employed massage therapist, I really felt like, I wanted to be home with my kids in the evening. And yet I had built an evening practice because that's when everybody wanted to massage, right? So my practice is like ebbed and flowed into like a thriving full-time, really busy practice to I just wanted part-time or not at all. But when I was teaching massage therapy, I wasn't doing any massage at all. And then that position ended. So I was bringing clients back on, and it was a big deal to me to really determine when am I going to be working with clients and when am I not.
When as an outsider watching that, it was like, I was so impressed and so proud to have you set such clear boundaries that say, I'm not doing any evenings Monday through Thursday because that's my time with my kids, and I'm only doing Fridays from this window and only Saturday mornings and nothing on Sundays or whatever your boundaries are. But what a role model and example for those of us watching you as you did that, because it was really refreshing to have somebody model that behavior.
And it's really wonderful when that actually works, but it's like if I told my students that to create the practice, like if they only want to work during the day, or if they only want to work during the evenings or weekends or whatever, to start off making that the only time that they're working massage therapy. And if they need to have a different job, go ahead and get the different job when you don't want to work. That way you can let it go. So if you have to end up having two jobs, work the job that you don't want during the times that you don't want. That's what I taught them, just because we have to make money, right? And if we want to spend our time, the long-term thing, if we want it from 8 to 2 in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning to 2 in the afternoon, then that's when we have to honor, that's the time boundary for that job. Even if there's nothing there yet, then
hold that space.
Yeah, hold the space. Get the money job at the other times, because you're going to let that go once that other space fills up. And so,
holding that space when it's not full. It's easy to hold that space when that space can be full.
Yeah.
But a challenge to hold that space when it's currently empty.
Yeah, when it's empty and you need money or you need something. Yeah.
And I think whether it's a job or a side hustle or, time for ourselves that we're like going to the gym or whatever those things are, like to carve out that space and hold that space and to really, it's a self-worth thing, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Boundaries.
Yeah.
I think we did pretty well discussing.
I think so. I can't think of, the saying no and the boundaries really go hand in hand, because establishing a boundary sounds like you're saying no anyway. It's like
a physical act then of once you have the boundary to be able to vocalize the word no.
Exactly.
The no is the vocalization of the internal boundary that you're setting.
Shaking the camera. It's making me think too about that today. Well, it might be kind of wishy-washy, weird with boundaries, but if today your boundary is you're not going to do something in the evening or whatever, but tomorrow you can. Right. You know what I mean? Right. So it's like.
Daily boundaries don't have to be indefinite forever. It can be situational. Right. And maybe with a particular person, maybe contingent on whatever else is going on or your energy.
We had talked about, how much time do we have? A little bit, a minute? Okay. We had talked about establishing new boundaries because relationships have changed. And that was something.
Think we can get that in 2 minutes?
Yes, in 2 minutes we can.
Go.
It's something I needed to do with my parents.
Okay.
And that took some space. I needed to hold a lot of space between us in order to determine what were the boundaries and where did they need to go. And any relationship, it could be a long-term relationship or just short-term relationships, just like quick relationships or something.
I agree. And I think we had, I noticed that in my first marriage, I didn't have boundaries. And so behaviors quickly got out of control. or what I felt to be out of control anyway. And so my marriage to my husband now, we went into that relationship with some clearly defined boundaries and some topics that were off limits, some behaviors that were off limits, some rules of engagement that were just the way we wanted to perform. And as a couple, we've had to really hold true to those boundaries. And sometimes I'm weaker and he's stronger, and sometimes he's stronger, vice versa. But clearly establishing some of those relationship boundaries has really been critical to the success of my marriage anyway.
Yeah.
So marriage boundaries, boundaries with our kids, boundaries with our work environment, boundaries with our clients, boundaries for ourselves, boundaries.
Yeah. Makes for a successful life, huh?
It sure does.
Yeah. All right. Yay. Episode 4
in the books.
Well done. Bye.
Bye.